Good morning. I have to say I have the greatest admiration for teachers because I was a teacher at one time, and I didn't make it very well. I taught in the 60s in inner city schools in Los Angeles. It was a very tumultuous time. What I'm going to try to do is put a face on genocide, put a human face on genocide, because that's what oral history is. It's really history from the perspective of those who actually went through it, rather than others writing what happened, the facts. These are people telling their stories, and it's amazing how, after listening to so many stories, you begin to weave the history and then compare the history books, and you see that there's tremendous similarity there, and that these people are not really making it up. I say that because when denial comes in, as the Turks continue to deny the Armenian genocide, and whenever we've spoken with Turks in the audience, they can really argue against facts of the genocide, but when we get up and tell individual stories, it's amazing how they just stay very silent, because you can't very well, tell a person that didn't happen, although they try to. Now, one of the reasons that we went into oral history is, as Sarah said, my parents are both survivors. My father's a sole survivor from a fairly large family. Half of my mother's family survived. And so I grew up with these stories. Although, like most survivors, when we ask them, have you told your stories to your children, they say, oh no, we try to spare them. My mother never talked about it. She was totally repressed. She never talked about it. My father would. But my father would only talk about the happy times before the genocide, and they really wouldn't talk about the genocide. They were trying to spare us. It was only in my adult life, after I got married, had my first son, we realized, my husband, who is non-Armenian, they call him an Odar, that we thought, my gosh, we really should write down your father's story, my dad's story, because it reads like a novel. I mean, it's a fascinating story, how he survived and so forth. And so we started taping his story over 8 weeks, and then realized, well, Mom is a survivor too, and that sort of kept leading on to doing 100 one-on-one interviews that lasted anywhere from 2 to 5, 6 hours each interview over the next 15 years. And then it was my task. I did most of the interviews in Armenian because people would feel more comfortable. These were elderly people. They were already in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And I felt they would be more comfortable speaking in their mother tongue rather than trying to do it in English. Then for years, I transcribed and translated these stories. And in the process, what I realized I was doing was I was trying to come to terms with this genocide. It was a really tough time for me because my kids were the same age as the survivors were during the genocide. They were 7 and 8. And I kept trying to imagine my kids going through this horror of genocide. And it was a very, very difficult time. Anyway, we went ahead, finished, and then wrote the book. Sarah was talking about it's this book. And then we thought, we're done with genocide. That's it. It's sad enough. It's morbid enough. No more. But then in 2001, we had an invitation to go to Rwanda in an international conference. And they invited representatives from all the genocides of the 20th century so we could go tell them how our people have coped, what we've done with oral history, with documentation, and so forth. And since at that time there were no Armenian survivors left, or if they were in their 90s, I was the next thing to a survivor. So they invited Don, my husband, and I to go and represent the Armenians. And I told my father's story. And it was amazing how many people in the audience came up afterwards and said, my gosh, that could have been my story. And I'll come back to a genocide. But so starting with the personal, trying to grow up in this community who always, when they got together, they would talk about genocide, to then doing, an actual oral history very systematically, and then moving on to Rwanda. And there we trained 2 separate groups. One was a group of orphans, head of households. They had survived, their parents were dead, and they were raising siblings or neighbor kids. And the other one was an organization called Avega, a group of widows. And we trained both of those groups to do oral history among their peers. So 100 with the orphans, 60 with the Avega, with the widows. Then we felt like we needed to do some ourselves. So the last 4 years, we've been going every year or twice a year, and we did 100 interviews, additional interviews, where we actually videotaped. So genocide has become, it's almost like it's becoming gotten in my DNA. But the important thing about doing these two genocides, the first in the 20th century and the last, like bookends, was it really helped me understand the two genocides in a way that I think I wouldn't have if I had only done one. Let me put it this way. When we were interviewing the Armenians, you know, it was kind of a distant history. You know, these people had told their story over and over again. There was a script. But there wasn't much emotion. The only emotion sometimes that we would feel during the interview would be when they would talk about the death of a mother or a father. Then they would break down. And it didn't matter whether they were 80, 90, or 60, or 50 years old. That was a very sore spot for them. But I had no idea, as we do now, about trauma, about PTSD. That never even crossed my mind, that these kids who, you know, for years were in the wilderness, in the deserts, really were very traumatized, until I went to Rwanda and saw what trauma looks like and how trauma takes over your whole life and how you can't function for years after the genocide. On the other hand, when I am with Rwandans, and we've been going since 2001 regularly, so some of these people really have become like family to us. In fact, a number of the kids call us parents. We've gotten very close to them. You know, we can give them hope that time heals, and telling your story is a good thing. You know, going back and visiting the places that you went through is a good thing. So it's really helped both of those. And so, you know, we've been able to connect. And it's exceptionally helpful to Rwandans for them to know what happened to the Armenians, you know, and what they can learn from that.